I've been married to Dana for 22 years. That's a lot of time. Long enough to build a life, a rhythm, 1,000 shared inside jokes and routines that quietly anchor you to someone. Long enough to take comfort in predictability, and also long enough to stop noticing when the ground starts shifting under your feet. The thing is, betrayal doesn't always come like a storm. Sometimes it starts as a soft sound in the distance. A phrase, a glance, a laugh that lasts too long. And by the time you turn to face it, it's already halfway through your door. For me, it started at a company holiday party in Seattle. Dana's company, not mine. I was just the plus one. I didn't know most of the people there. I'd met a few once or twice in passing, but I wasn't part of her world like that. I didn't mind. Honestly, I was proud of her. She had worked hard, climbed the ladder, earned respect. These events were her thing. I'd just show up, smile, and stay out of the way. The party was held at some upscale venue downtown, with glass walls overlooking the city. It was cold out. December in Seattle always is. But inside, the place was buzzing. Lights dimmed just enough to be festive, soft jazz playing over the speakers, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. The kind of party where everyone's pretending they're not thinking about work. But they are. Dana looked incredible that night. Dark green dress, heels I hadn't seen before. She wore her hair up, something she used to do a lot when we were younger but hadn't in a while. I told her she looked beautiful. She smiled, touched my arm lightly, and said, "Thanks, babe." Then she moved toward a group of coworkers just like that. I wasn't offended. That was the routine. She'd mingle. I'd find a quiet corner or get pulled into conversation by one of the other spouses. I got a drink and watched her work the room. Charming, polished, confident. She laughed easily with people, touched their arms when she talked. She was the version of herself I didn't see at home anymore. Not cold, exactly. Just different. More awake. Alive even. That should have been the first sign, but it wasn't. The moment I still can't forget came about an hour in. One of the senior managers, I think his name was Greg, stood up and tapped a glass. A round of toasts. You know how it goes. Everyone raising glasses to the team, to a successful year, to work family and grind culture, and all that sanitized corporate poetry. And then Dana raised her glass. "To my other half, Daniel," she said, lifting her drink toward a man across the room. "Couldn't have survived these deadlines without you." People laughed. Someone clapped. Daniel grinned and mock bowed, playing into it like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there, blinking, half smiling. My brain needed a second to catch up with what I just heard. Your other half? It hit me like a subtle gut punch. Not painful enough to knock the wind out of me, but enough to make me suddenly aware of my breathing. I looked around. No one else seemed fazed. Just laughter and raised glasses. She turned back to her group like it was nothing. Like I wasn't even standing 5 feet away. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a joke. An inside reference. Something I didn't understand. But it didn't feel like a joke. Not the way she said it. It wasn't playful or sarcastic. Came out smooth, like something she'd said before. Like something familiar. Daniel, I didn't know much about him. I'd seen his name on her phone once or twice when she showed me memes or calendar stuff. I assumed he was just a guy on her team. I knew they worked closely, but that's all it had been until that moment. After the toast, I found myself watching him from across the room. He was handsome, no denying that. Younger than me by a few years, probably mid-30s. Tall, good jawline, expensive watch. He looked comfortable in his skin, the kind of guy who'd been told his whole life he belonged wherever he stood. He didn't glance my way. He didn't have to. We left the party a little after 10. Dana was a little buzzed, just enough to soften the edges. I drove us back to the hotel in silence. She talked about the event, who said how she was glad it went well. I nodded, made the right noises, but something was grinding in the back of my mind. Upstairs, in the hotel room, I finally said it. "You called Daniel your other half." She looked up from her makeup bag. "What?" "At the party," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "You raised your glass and said he was your other half. That was a little weird, wasn't it?" She stared at me for half a second too long before letting out a small laugh. Not an amused one, a dismissive one. "Oh my God, Mark, are you really upset about that? It's a joke. That's just how we talk at work. Don't be so sensitive." It didn't feel like a joke. Well, it was. Jesus. Her tone sharpened. "You don't understand what it's like in that environment. We spend hours grinding on deadlines, weekends, all of that. Sometimes it just helps to make it fun. You think I'm emotionally involved or something? Seriously?" I didn't say anything. I just watched her face. She was defensive. A little too much. She kept going. "You always do this. We go to one of my events and you act weird the whole time. Then you bring up some offhand comment and turn it into a whole thing. It's exhausting." That stung. I wasn't trying to fight. I was trying to understand. But in the space of a few minutes, the conversation had flipped entirely. Now I was the problem. Not her word choice. Not Daniel. Me. I went quiet, brushed my teeth, climbed into bed. She lay next to me a few minutes later, scrolling on her phone, her back to me. I stared at the ceiling, the words still echoing in my head. Other half. Something had shifted, and no one else in that room noticed. Maybe they'd all been watching it shift for a long time. Maybe I was the last one to catch up. The next morning, we flew home. She was cheerful, talkative, telling me how great the turnout was, how everyone seemed relaxed for once. She laughed when she recapped something Greg said. I smiled when I was supposed to, but I felt like I was watching her from the outside, like I wasn't married to her anymore, just sitting next to someone I used to know. That night, after we got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to her soft, rhythmic breathing and thought about all the little things I'd brushed off over the past few months. The late nights, the phone always face down, the new gym routine, the unfamiliar perfume. Maybe none of it meant anything. Maybe I was being sensitive. But in my gut, something had changed. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing exploded. No tears or slammed doors. Just a shift. A small but undeniable crack in the foundation. And the worst part was, I didn't know if she even noticed it had formed. Or worse, maybe she had and just didn't care. After the party in Seattle, I told myself to let it go. I really tried. For a few weeks, I buried the moment, the toast, the phrase other half. The way she shrugged it off like it was nothing. I buried it the way you bury all the little things in a long marriage. You get good at telling yourself that one moment doesn't matter. That the history you've built is too solid to be shaken by a word, a glance, a laugh that lingered too long. But then the silence started getting louder. There wasn't a sudden explosion. That's the thing. It's not like one day everything was fine and the next it wasn't. It was subtle, quiet, like watching a slow leak in a boat. Nothing seems urgent until you're already sinking. I started to notice patterns, or maybe I started seeing things I should have noticed long ago. I'd come home from work and she wouldn't be there. At first, she'd let me know. Texted something about staying late to help wrap up a project. Normal enough. But those messages started coming later, less often, and always vague. Sometimes she wouldn't even mention she was staying late until I texted to ask where she was. "Sorry, I forgot to say, just working late with the team. I'll be home soon." Soon became later. Later became after midnight. And more than once, she came home after I'd already fallen asleep. The next morning, she'd act like everything was fine. I stopped asking questions because her answers started sounding more like rehearsals than conversations. Then there were the business trips. Dana had always traveled a little for work, maybe once or twice a year. But suddenly there were back-to-back team offsites, product launch meetings, and regional coordination visits. All short. 2 days, 3 max. But they popped up like weeds. Always last minute. Always impossible to schedule around. And always alone. I offered to drive her to the airport. She declined. Said it would be easier if she just called a car. Said she didn't want to make me go out of my way. That sounded considerate, except Dana had never been the type to care about that before. We used to enjoy those rides. Coffee in the cup holder. Some music low on the radio. Her hand resting on my leg while we waited in traffic. Now, she didn't even want to say goodbye in person. Then came the phone. It started staying face down. Always. Even at home, especially at home. It would buzz, and she'd tap the screen to silence it without looking. Or she'd pick it up, glance at it quickly, and then slide it into her pocket like it was radioactive. And the passcode changed. Not once, but twice. She didn't tell me. I found out by accident. Went to check the weather one morning while she was in the shower and got hit with a screen I hadn't seen before. She used to roll her eyes when I teased her for having no lock at all. "What do I have to hide?" She'd laugh. Apparently now something. She brushed it off when I asked. Said it was a company policy. Said everyone was required to do it now. I don't know if that's true. I didn't press. I just nodded and let it slide into the growing pile of things that didn't sit right. Then, one night, she came home from the gym without a trace of sweat on her. I remember it vividly. It was a Thursday. I was sitting on the couch, half watching some crime show, half scrolling through my phone. She walked in the door carrying her gym bag, keys jingling like always. She smiled, or tried to, but her face looked wiped clean of emotion, like she'd rehearsed a neutral expression and stuck to it too long. I stood up to give her a quick hug, like I always did, and when she leaned in, I noticed something. She didn't smell like the gym. No sweat. No rubbery yoga mat smell. No shampoo from the locker room showers. She smelled like perfume. Not hers. I couldn't place it exactly, but it wasn't the scent I knew. Dana had worn the same perfume for years. Warm, floral, subtle. This one was sharper, new, and stronger than it needed to be after a workout. "You didn't work out?" I asked casually. She hesitated just for a second. "Of course I did. Why?" "You don't seem tired," I said. She gave a short laugh, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "I took it easy tonight. Didn't feel like pushing too hard." Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. That's when I started thinking about the weekends, how they'd slowly disappeared. We used to make plans every Saturday. Brunches, day trips, long walks through farmers markets. We'd cook dinner together on Sundays. Nothing extravagant, just little rituals, routines that made us feel connected. But over the past few months, our weekends had become fragmented. She was catching up on emails. She had a virtual team sync. She was just tired and needed to rest. Or she had errands she needed to run alone. I offered to go with her once. She smiled and said, "It's fine, I won't be long." She was gone for 5 hours. When I asked where she went, she told me she lost track of time in a bookstore. The next day, I found the receipt from a wine bar in her coat pocket. She hadn't mentioned that part. I told myself not to read into it, that people change, schedules get messy, couples drift a little and find their way back. But every time I reached out to bridge the gap, made a reservation, suggested a drive, brought up a show we could watch together, she had a reason to decline. Not mean about it, just tired, or had plans. Or maybe next weekend. I started keeping track. Not intentionally at first, just mentally tallying how many times I'd asked, and how many times the answer was no. The number grew fast. So did the distance. Conversations became logistics. Who's picking up the dry cleaning? Did you pay the water bill? Are you going to be home for dinner? No more idle stories from her day. No more, "You won't believe what happened at work." Just silence. Cold, dull, functional silence. Sometimes she'd still say, "I love you," when she left the house. Other times she wouldn't. I'd wait for it. Linger near the door as she grabbed her bag, hoping it would come naturally like it used to. Sometimes I'd say it first just to see. She'd smile, say it back. But the tone was flat, like muscle memory, like obligation. It was around this time I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, playing back every conversation from the day, dissecting her expressions, her tone, her words. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into it, but I kept going back to that moment in Seattle. That other half. The way it came out of her so smoothly, the way she didn't even look at me, that wasn't a joke. That was a truth said out loud by mistake. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. None of these changes had happened recently. I just started noticing recently, but they'd been happening for months. A slow shift, a quiet drift, a methodical removal of me from her orbit. She wasn't gone, not physically, but emotionally. She was packing up one piece at a time, folding away the warmth, the connection, the presence, leaving behind only what she needed to keep up appearances. To anyone else, it probably looked fine. We still lived together, still talked, still shared a last name. But I could feel it, the hollowing out, like I was becoming background noise in my own life. And the worst part? I still didn't have proof. No texts, no phone calls, no lipstick on the collar. Just a growing mountain of signs, memories that I used to brush off now fitting together like puzzle pieces, and the picture they formed wasn't one I wanted to see. But it was getting harder to look away. It's strange how fast the holidays come, even when you're not in the mood for them. By the time December 30th rolled around, I was still pretending. Pretending everything was normal. Pretending I hadn't been spending my evenings pacing the living room. Pretending I wasn't waiting for Dana's car to pull into the driveway long after dinner went cold. Pretending the distance between us wasn't growing so fast I could barely see her on the other side of it. Then came New Year's Eve. She mentioned it in passing a few days before. Said her company was organizing a team-building getaway out of town. Something about a retreat cabin near the water, a tradition the department had started last year. I raised an eyebrow, not because it was suspicious on its own, but because I'd never heard of it before, and we'd been through 22 New Year's Eves together. "You're not going to be home?" I asked. She barely looked up from her laptop. "I told you already, babe. It's a company thing. They want us to bond, get aligned for Q1. You told me you might have something, not that you'd be gone on New Year's." She sighed and closed the screen. "Mark, come on. This one night. You'll be fine." That word again, you. As if I were just an afterthought. As if we weren't supposed to be each other's home. Still, I didn't fight. I could have pushed harder, asked questions, challenged the logic. But I didn't. Because some part of me was tired of pretending. And some deeper part of me already knew what was happening. I just didn't have the proof. Not yet. So I watched her pack. A light suitcase. Casual outfits, some business casual. But I noticed she slipped in the red coat, the one she usually saved for special nights out. She grabbed a new pair of boots I hadn't seen her wear in months. She double-checked her makeup bag. She wasn't rushing. She was curating. And she looked excited in a way that didn't fit a corporate retreat. She left the afternoon of the 31st. Kissed me goodbye like she always did, soft, quick, routine. No eye contact, just a whisper of movement before she turned and walked out the door. The silence in the house was immediate. No noise from upstairs. No scent of her perfume trailing behind her. No dinner to prepare. No plans to make. No champagne chilling in the fridge. Just me, standing in the kitchen, wondering if I should open the bottle anyway or leave it sealed like the conversation we never had. I didn't do anything dramatic that night. No PI. No tracking her car. Just me and my phone. Scrolling. Clicking. Digging in the only way I knew how. It started harmlessly. I checked her social media, no updates, no posts. She was quiet online, always had been. But some of her colleagues weren't. One in particular, a woman named Melinda, who I vaguely remembered from the Seattle party. She posted constantly. Group selfies, toasts, Happy New Year from the team, kinds of things. I clicked on her story out of idle curiosity. And that's when I saw it. Dana, standing in front of a fire pit, surrounded by sparklers and clinking glasses. And standing next to her, Daniel. Him. Her other half. The same man from the toast. The same man she'd barely mentioned again. The same man she'd defended like it was absurd to even ask. She was in his arms. Not just standing beside him. Wrapped in him. One of her hands resting lightly on his chest. Her head tilted toward his shoulder. They looked, mate, comfortable, like a couple that had celebrated more than one New Year's together. The clip was short, maybe 5 seconds. Just a burst of video as the group shouted Happy New Year, and fireworks went off in the background. But it was long enough. long enough to confirm what I had spent months trying not to admit to myself. She wasn't with coworkers. She wasn't bonding for Q1. She wasn't out of town on business. She was with him, laughing, celebrating, holding him in a way she hadn't held me in years. I didn't know what to do with myself. I must have watched that clip 20 times, each time hoping I'd somehow misinterpreted it. That there was a context I couldn't see, that the angle made it look worse than it was. But no angle lies that cleanly. I recognized that look in her eyes. It was the look she used to give me. Before things got routine, before the silences, before her phone was always face down and her eyes always somewhere else. She looked happy, not conflicted, not guilty, just happy. And I realized something brutal. She hadn't just made a mistake. This wasn't some one-time lapse of judgment, some late-night regret. She had built this. She had chosen this. Bit by bit, excuse by excuse, she had created a new life, one I wasn't part of, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. And I was home, alone, sitting in my quiet house, scrolling through someone else's celebration, watching my wife lean into another man's arms like she belonged there. I don't remember how long I sat in that chair. At some point I stood, poured a drink I didn't finish, and wandered the house like a ghost. I touched the couch where we used to curl up and binge-watch shows. I ran my fingers along the edge of the dining table where we used to have wine on Friday nights. I stared at the framed photo on the wall. Us, in our 20s, sunburned and smiling on a beach in California. That couple was gone. And the woman in that photo, she didn't exist anymore. I tried to tell myself not to spiral. That maybe it wasn't physical. That maybe there were still pieces left to salvage. But the truth was sitting in my chest like lead. She chose not to spend New Year's with me. Not out of necessity, but because she didn't want to. She didn't make a mistake. She made a plan. And for the first time, I couldn't deny it. I didn't sleep that night. The fireworks outside rattled the windows around midnight, but I didn't go look. I just lay there, fully awake, in the bed we used to share. The bed that now felt like someone else's. When the sun finally came up, I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt done. Not in the dramatic way you imagine when you think about betrayal. Not with screaming or threats or packed bags. Just an internal stillness. Like watching the final piece of a puzzle click into place and realizing it was never the picture you thought you were building. I didn't text her that morning. She didn't text me either. By the time she came home late the next day, the air in the house had already changed. She tried to act normal, kissed me on the cheek, gave me a rundown of the retreat, told me the cabin was cute and the view was incredible. She didn't mention Daniel. Not once. I nodded through it, smiled politely, didn't ask questions. Because I didn't need to. Not peaceful, just muted, like the world had turned the volume down on everything except my thoughts. Dana moved through the house as if nothing had happened. She talked about work, about traffic, about some show she wanted to watch. I listened, nodded, and answered when necessary. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Once the proof existed, my mind began to rewind. Every moment I had brushed aside came back, lining up with a clarity that was almost cruel. I wasn't discovering something new. I was finally understanding something old. I realized the betrayal didn't begin with Daniel. It didn't begin with New Year's Eve or even with that night in Seattle. It began much earlier, quietly, invisibly, when she started pulling away long before I noticed the distance. I thought back to the way she stopped sharing her day. At first, it was subtle. Fewer stories over dinner. Less curiosity about mine. Then it became routine silence. I told myself it was stress, career pressure, exhaustion. I wanted to believe that because the alternative meant admitting I was no longer the person she came home to emotionally. There were moments I remembered with painful precision. The time she forgot our anniversary dinner reservation and blamed her calendar app. The way she flinched when I touched her shoulder unexpectedly. The nights she went to bed early but stayed awake on her phone. The screen lighting her face while her back was turned to me. Those weren't random behaviors. They were steps. Preparations. She had left emotionally long before she left physically. That realization hit harder than the image of her in his arms. Because cheating wasn't the first betrayal. Abandonment was. She had withdrawn piece by piece, and I had adjusted each time, shrinking myself to fit the space she allowed me. I made excuses for her, defended her to myself, convinced myself that long marriages go through seasons like this. But this wasn't a season. It was an exit. I saw now how carefully she managed it. She kept enough normalcy to avoid confrontation, enough affection to prevent questions, enough distance to build something new without tearing down the old right away. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was a placeholder, a familiar backdrop that made her new life easier to construct. What hurt most was realizing how often she'd been irritated with me for no real reason. The short answers, the sighs, the way my presence seemed to annoy her. I thought it was resentment built from unresolved issues between us. In reality, I was inconvenient. I was evidence of a life she was already replacing. I replayed the arguments we'd had that year, how she framed them, how quickly she shifted blame onto me. My mood, my questions, my negativity. She wasn't reacting to problems in the marriage. She was creating justification. Every disagreement became proof in her mind that she deserved something else. I wondered how long she'd been telling herself that story. Probably long enough to believe it completely. That's when I stopped blaming myself. Not because I was perfect, I wasn't, but because I finally understood the sequence. I didn't cause her to cheat by being inattentive or flawed. She cheated because she chose to leave without leaving. Because it was easier to rewrite our history than to face me honestly. I had been demoted without being informed. Reduced to background noise in my own life. Once that truth settled in, the pain changed shape. It was still there, but it wasn't chaotic anymore. It was sharp, clean, and grounded in reality. I wasn't losing something in the present. I had already lost it in the past. I just hadn't known it yet. And strangely, that clarity brought calm. Because if she had already gone, then there was nothing left for me to chase. No conversation that could bring her back. No explanation that would make sense. The marriage I was mourning didn't exist anymore. It hadn't for a long time. I was just the last one to find out. That realization didn't make the betrayal smaller. It made it final. And for the first time since Seattle, I stopped asking why, and started accepting what was. She hadn't drifted away by accident. She had been leaving on purpose. When the mind breaks, it rarely makes a sound. People expect drama. Raised voices, thrown dishes, a suitcase slammed shut. But after 22 years with someone, there comes a point where the silence speaks louder than anything else. That's what it was like the morning I decided to leave. Not run, not hide, just leave. It was a quiet decision. No warning, no speech. Just the end of a long, slow realization that staying in the house with her, pretending, tolerating, existing side by side wasn't strength. It was a kind of self-erasure. And I was done erasing myself. It happened the first Monday after the holidays. The world was returning to normal. Schools reopening, traffic back on the roads, neighbors dragging their bins to the curb in the cold morning dark. Dana was in the kitchen, making coffee, humming something soft under her breath. The same woman who had spent New Year's with another man now stood a few feet away like nothing had changed. Maybe to her, nothing had. She handed me a mug. I took it. She asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. Then I went upstairs and started packing. Not in a rage. Not with tears. Just with purpose. I laid out my essentials, documents, clothes, the worn leather wallet she gave me for our 10th anniversary. I stood for a long moment looking at my wedding ring. I'd worn it every day since the moment she slid it on my finger. I took it off. I left it on the nightstand. A symbol. Not of revenge. Not of anger. Just clarity. I knew better than to tell her then. She would try to spin it. Twist the narrative. Flip the blame. Make it about my coldness. My refusal to work through it. I wasn't giving her that opportunity. I wasn't giving her anything anymore. I wrote a note. Just a few lines. Enough to make it clear I was leaving, but not enough to invite debate. I wasn't interested in closure. Closure is a privilege both parties earn. She had forfeited hers when she made me a prop in her performance. I put the note on the kitchen table right next to her planner, the one with all her carefully arranged meetings and goals and color-coded boxes. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't slam a door or leave things in disarray. I wanted it to look exactly like I'd been there, and simply vanished, because that's how she'd made me feel, like I'd slowly disappeared. It wasn't until I pulled out of the driveway that I let myself breathe. Really breathe, like I'd been holding it in for months and only now remembered how. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just drove, gripping the wheel tightly enough to turn my knuckles white, watching the house fade into the rearview mirror like a place I once knew but no longer recognized. I didn't have a destination that morning. I just needed distance. I ended up at a hotel on the edge of town. Clean, quiet, anonymous. I paid in cash. Checked in under just my first name. Not because I was hiding from her, but because I needed, for the first time in a long time, to exist without being anyone's husband. The room was simple. White linens, a small desk, a window with a view of nothing in particular. I dropped my bag and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence wasn't heavy this time. Felt earned. I texted a friend from college I hadn't seen in years. Someone who had moved out of state and offered me a spare room if I ever needed it. I told him I might take him up on that soon. He didn't ask questions. Just said, "You're welcome anytime." That was enough. For the rest of the day, I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder if Dana had seen the note. I didn't worry about what she would say, or how she would spin it to her friends, or if she'd even care. Because this part wasn't about her. It was about reclaiming my voice. For too long, every attempt to talk, to express how I felt, had been met with deflection, minimization. Her mood, her stress, her exhaustion, her justifications. There was never room for me in the story she was writing, and I'd kept waiting for a chapter where I'd matter again. But that chapter never came, so I stopped reading. I closed the book. I chose myself, and for the first time in over 2 decades, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't name yet, but it felt a lot like freedom. She would call. She would text. She would have questions, concerns, maybe even tears. But I was done with performances, with guilt, with letting someone else tell me what was real. Let her build her new life with Daniel or whoever came after him. I wasn't part of that story. And now, finally, she wasn't part of mine either. About a month after I left, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, and that decision closed the last remaining door of doubt. The woman on the other end introduced herself quietly. She was Daniel's wife. She didn't accuse. She didn't rage. She spoke the way someone does when they're already exhausted from knowing too much. She said she'd found messages, hotel confirmations, overlapping travel dates. My wife's name appeared again and again, threaded through months of lies that mirrored my own. She sent proof. **TS. Receipts. Timelines. What I felt wasn't shock. It was confirmation. The kind that finally lifts the weight of self-blame. This wasn't an impulsive affair. It was deliberate, long-running, carefully hidden. 2 families had been used as cover stories for a life already in progress. When the call ended, I sat in silence, strangely grateful. Not for the betrayal, but for the certainty. There was nothing left to question. Nothing left to wonder if I'd misunderstood. I hadn't imagined any of it. I learned later how she'd been telling the story. To friends, I was distant, emotionally unstable, hard to live with. To coworkers, the marriage had been over for years. I had been rewritten as the obstacle, the reason she had to leave, not the man she betrayed. And people believed it, because silence looks like guilt when lies are spoken confidently. So I stopped being silent, but not loudly. I filed for divorce with facts, not emotion. Timelines, evidence, dates. No speeches, no public scenes, just truth on paper. Months later, I saw a photo of her and Daniel together, smiling openly this time. By then, I was living in another city. New mornings, new routines, coffee that tasted like peace. I didn't disappear. I simply walked out of a story where I no longer existed. and started one that didn't require me to explain myself at all.